Hello and welcome to this Varonis tutorial entitled How to Auto-Provision Microsoft Teams with PowerShell. Onboarding new employees into Teams is a recurring and frankly pretty boring process I'm sure many admins out there have to deal with all of the time. Automating that entire process or providing with a framework to build on top of with PowerShell will save you tons of time. Let's get going and see how much time we can save by automating this with PowerShell. Before we get into the demo on how to build this PowerShell script, why would you want to listen to me anyway? Who am I? Well, my name is Adam Bertram and I've been in the Microsoft automation space for a long time now. I'm a 5-time Microsoft MVP, originally a PowerShell MVP when they had those at one time. I also do a lot of automation and DevOps work, primarily in the Microsoft ecosystem, and do a whole lot of writing. If you search for anything PowerShell, you'll probably come across my articles on many different sites as well as my own blog at adamtheautomator.com. Since I love writing so much, I went and wrote a book too, PowerShell for Sysadmins. That book has gotten a lot of great feedback, and I invite you to take a look at it if you're more interested in learning PowerShell. Finally, if you want to reach out to me for anything at all, feel free to hit me up on Twitter at adbertram. Now you'll be happy to know this tutorial only has 3 slides. This is the last one, I promise. In this tutorial, you're going to build a PowerShell script. This PowerShell script is going to save you tons of time automating onboard a Teams user. In this script, you're going to set up a demo Azure AD group and some users. We'll then perform a few common steps like creating a new team, adding some team members, some apps, and then to top it all off, we're going to automate many common steps when you need to onboard a new Teams user. You'll come away with a PowerShell script you can use, modify, and add to make it work in your own environment. So let's get started with the demo. In this demo, I'm here in Visual Studio Code and I have the PowerShell extension installed. This will be the primary environment that I will be demonstrating this script in. Now you don't have to use Visual Studio Code if you don't want to. You can use any other editor that you wish. However, if you want to follow along exactly and make it look exactly like I have it here, you will need to do this. And another one thing I wanted to mention, you see I have PowerShell here and you have PowerShell Integrated Console. I'm using Windows PowerShell for this tutorial versus the PowerShell Core, which I would normally use because unfortunately there are some problems with the Azure AD module that you will be required to use. So instead of kind of swapping back and forth, I just decided to go with the path of the least resistance and we're going to be using Windows PowerShell 5.1 in Windows 10 for this. To kind of put a scenario around this tutorial, let's say that perhaps you're in an environment where you have Teams, you have Azure AD, and you want to bring on a new department. Maybe your organization acquired a company, you want to create a new group. Essentially, you want to create a new Teams environment. Maybe you want to create a new team, some new Teams channels, and add a bunch of users to it. Essentially, just do a group of onboarding tasks all at once. So that's what this demo is going to be around. All right, next up, we need to create a CSV file. The CSV file is essentially going to be the input of everything. So think of creating a new Teams environment. We are going to need to have a bunch of users. Let's say that we have a bunch of users in a CSV file or perhaps a text file, just some kind of input, maybe even a database, some kind of input that we can pass to this script. So in this region here, I'm just creating a text file with 3 usernames in it, Adele, Grady, and Lee, that we'll be using as input. So let me go ahead and do that now. All right, so now we have a text file at users.txt, and it just contains 3 usernames, Adele, Grady, and Lee. Now that we have the input created, we can continue. So before we can actually do any kind of actual work, we first need to get some modules installed. So fortunately, Microsoft has provided a few different PowerShell modules for us, so we don't have to worry about getting into the APIs and figuring out how all that works. There are some shortcuts here we can use. So the first module that we need is called Azure AD, and you will install that with install module. So if I run this, I've already have it installed, so it's going to be pretty quick, but you essentially just run install module, provide the name, and then Azure AD. And it will work exactly like you'd intend. Next up, we need the Microsoft Teams module, and that's going to be pretty quick because I already have it in there, but it's the same kind of process. You just need to get those 2 modules installed. And then what I like to do is explicitly import these. So I will import Azure AD, see if that imports successfully. Yep, and then I will import Microsoft Teams, and that worked as well. All right, once we have all of the modules installed, Next, we need to authenticate. We need to authenticate to Teams and also to Active Directory. We do that with the two connect commands that you see here. So I'm going to run this and then come over here to my sign in, provide my sign in information. Now my tenant is called adamtheautomator.com. Yours may be something on Microsoft.com or something like that. Once I'm signed in, yep, we shouldn't get an error, and you can see that my account is adam@adamautomator.com, my environment is Azure Cloud, my tenant ID, and all that good stuff. So it looked there. Next up, we do the same thing for Connect Azure AD. No error, which is good, and looks like we are authenticated with my adam@adamtheautomator.com account there as well. Great, so we are now authenticated to both services. Now we are ready to go and do whatever we need to do. Next, you may have some Azure AD users ahead of time that you would like to use. You may not have to explicitly create them, but to provide a full end-to-end demo experience when creating brand new test users. So you can create new users if you would like, or even you can use existing users if you like. It really doesn't matter. So for this step, I'm going to create a few of these users for testing. And to do that, I'm using the new Azure AD user commandlet. So in 36 to 37 here, I'm dividing the password. This is just a simple password. I'm not even doing anything crazy. You can even create a random password if you want, that sort of thing. But these are just going to be test users. I just need some users to play with. And then on line 40 through 49 is where we get into it. There we are looping through the users variable, which if you remember, just has those three usernames in it, looping through each of these and creating an Azure AD user account for each of them. So let me copy this and run all these and make sure and see if this works. All right, we got an error. What is this? Bad request. Another obsolete thing already exists. All right. I like to kind of keep these troubleshooting things in here because when you're writing PowerShell, things will come up. So instead of going in and manually removing these, what I typically do here is I may have forgotten to make this idempotent, which means essentially I can run the script over and over again. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a line in here called get AD Azure user, and then do my search string. I believe it's search string, and then search for the account. Error action ignore, which means to don't give me an error if you can't find it. Put this in an if statement. Tab that over and just say if it does not exist. Let's see if that works. So now we're going to first check for the existence of it, and if it does not exist, then it will create it. So let's run that again. And we didn't get any errors this time because it did actually have all these in here. So that's another quick thing you can do just whenever you're writing your PowerShell scripts. Check first the state that the object is in, and then go with it. All right, so now that we know that the user accounts are created, we need to create an Azure AD group. The Azure AD group is good to link to a team because then you can just easily add and remove group members as you will. You don't really have to, but it's really easy. It really allows you, as you'll see in a minute, it allows you to see lots more properties, enumerate some more information about the users. All right, so for this instance, let's say that we have a department called finance. I have some params here. We're going to have the display name, finance users. It's going to be not mail enabled, so we cannot email to it. It's a security group, and there's the nickname. And essentially, we just run new Azure AD group. And we run this, and it may not work if we don't have it already. Yep, all right, good. We didn't have the Azure AD group set up already. So now I assign that to a variable, and now we have the object ID. This is exactly what we need. We're going to need the ID to then add some new members in it, provide it to the Teams account, and so forth. All right, now that we have the Azure AD group, now what we can do is add the users that we just created, or any other user that you have in your environment, to that Azure AD group. We do that with add Azure AD group member. And you can see here, I'm first looping through these into the users, my for each loop, and then I'm querying for the Azure AD user. We need that Azure AD user object ID to add them to the group. We need the object ID to pass to the object ID parameter here of add Azure AD group member. That adds all of the Azure AD users to the Azure AD group called finance users that we just created. All right, next up, let's just see if they are actually in there. We can verify that by running get Azure AD group member. And yep, you can see here that there are 3 objects. Each of our display names for our usernames are in there. So now we have the Azure AD users created and the group and the users added into the group. Now that we're done with the Azure AD stuff, we can create a new team. This uses the Microsoft Teams module. And I put in here just some interesting parameters that you can use. The new team, I believe it's the new, the new team commandlet has lots of different parameters you can use that do all kinds of different things. So you can set the display name, the description, allow, you can allow and disallow all kinds of different things. I'm not going to do anything fancy in here. You can by all means look at this and figure these out on your own if you need something different. But for now, I just provided some simple parameters that we can use. So we're using the new team commandlet, part of the Microsoft Teams module. We're setting a display name for the finance department, financial department, visibility private. All these should be fairly self-explanatory. Essentially, we're just creating a new team with these few custom attributes. So I'm going to run that, and then that should create the new Microsoft Teams team. This may take a little bit. Sometimes there's a pause, and to be honest with you, the Microsoft Teams module is a little bit flaky sometimes. I don't know if it's a fairly new module, but there were some times where things just didn't work how they should. But I managed to get to a point to where things worked the huge majority of the time. So now that it looks like it was created, let's see what it looks like in my team variable. Yep, we have our group ID, display name, mail and nickname, blah, blah, blah. Okay, great. So we have the team created. So let me go ahead and collapse this. And then now we need to add all of the users that we just created to the team. So do this pretty simple. On line 145, we run get Azure AD group member to find all of those group members. And then we loop through those in 146 and then run add team user, provide the group ID of that Azure AD group, the user ID that we're getting from the group members, and then the role of members. We're just going to make them a member role. Right. Once we do that, all those teams users should now be assigned to that group. Next up, continuing on, there's a few other things that you could do. You could do all kinds of different things with the Teams module. So if you're curious, if you have the Microsoft Teams module created, you can run git command module Microsoft Teams, and this is the commandlets that you have available to you. You can search by these or using the help, so new team, I don't know, channel, something like that. PowerShell help has some pretty good help information there, so you can kind of figure out what you want to do if you need to create a different team environment. All right, so next up, once we have that team created, I'm just going to add a few channels in here. These could be anything. Right now, I'm just assuming that maybe there's one for accountants, projects, reconciliation, and managers. You can really have anything in here whatsoever. But you can see by the notes, I did have a few issues with making some of these private and managing this. I think that's because the Microsoft Teams module is so new. There's still a few bugs here and there, but these commands that I have here should work just fine. So I'm just going to run these, and these will add new channels to this team. After every one, it should come back some output showing me each of the objects that it is creating, and it looks like it is. All right, so that's done. No error is good. All right, so now at this point, we have created the CSV file. So we have a CSV file of the usernames, installed the modules, created a few Azure AD users, created a group, created a team, added the group members to the team, modified the team channel, so we added a few team channels. There's lots of different things we can do, but I wanted to just kind of get a sample of a demonstration of what you can do. I'm going to go ahead and clean this up. Whenever you write a script, it's always a good idea to have remove functionality as well, because you want to maintain the entire life cycle of the automation that you're building if possible. Now to do that, I'm going to remove that team that I just created, and then I will go ahead and remove the group as well. So in this script, I'm just showing you this as a demo. You're not going to actually take this script and run it in your environment because it's just me interactively going through one of the line by line. However, I have provided a script that you can use for this that you can actually take out and run in your environment. So to demonstrate this script is called new team group.ps1. it has a few different parameters here, which is completely customizable to your liking. So we have the new team group automates all of this stuff that we just did all in one little tool. Whenever this script runs, it will do exactly all of this stuff, make all this stuff happen, and be done with it. It saves a ton of time. This script has a few different parameters. Azure AD user, that is one or more Azure AD user object that you get back from get Azure AD user. In 176 here, you can see we're just pulling all of those, reading all of the users in that CSV file and just getting Azure AD object for each of those. Then we have the team name. I'm just going to call it finance. That's going to be the team name. In team is going to be the name of the Azure AD group. And here we also have channel. We have the channels parameter that allows you to specify a configurable set of different channels that you would add. Here we have 2 that are comma delimited. That goes up here where we have, under here we have different team channels. And right here, these were explicitly set. If we have a parameter called channel, we can just add or remove any of these and it will go ahead and make it happen. And then finally I added one just on a whim called team option, called allow custom means, because if you remember up here, whenever we were creating the team, we had a lot of different options that we could use. You know, all of these, allow a user, allow add remove apps, lots of different permissions, and we had these statically signed in here. Here with this parameter, we're able to just dynamically add all these into here, and we can set these at runtime. All right, and then, yep, I have a verbose line in here. So let me go over, before I run this, let me first go over what this script looks like. I'm not going to go over in detail because we already went through the majority of the work, but for now I'm just going to go quickly go over what this script looked like. So here you see new team group, and you can see here now that it's a quote-unquote official looking PowerShell script or official looking tool. It has the requires, some comment-based help, and some parameters here. Whenever you're building a tool like this, a script, you want to make it as standalone as possible, make it as flexible as possible. So in here, we don't want to add all those connect statements, install module, all that stuff they did before. We want to make sure those are requirements to make sure those are set. So remember in the start of the demo, I said we needed to use Windows PowerShell for this. So whenever you have these requires statements up here, we are enforcing Windows PowerShell, which is called desktop, the PS edition, and we make sure that Azure AD and the Microsoft Teams module is installed. It's always a good idea to have those validations up front. And then here's we have the parameter set. These are completely customizable. That's the great thing about this script, about PowerShell. Customize it to your liking. Add new team options, a new team name, add AD user. So these are the parameters that we're going to provide into it. And here you can see this script is very much slimmed down from what that line-by-line interactive script is. Essentially it does everything we did before. Creates a group, add the users to the previously created group, exactly the same thing. Creates the team. Here's where this part right here, this came as trial and error because whenever I was running this really fast, not interactively, all at once, there was a too many requests API error here, so I had this start sleep in it. That was a kind of a after the fact thing. And then here you see if team option. That's another piece of logic. If the user passes any of these team options, they are not mandatory, it will add these dynamically to this params splatting here, so this block. And then once it's built out all those parameters, then it will run new team and it will create the team. And then adding the group members, all exactly the same process. And then adding the new team channels for whatever you pass up here. Now notice that these are not mandatory. So it may not create the channels or it may not even add any additional team options at all, even if you don't pass them. So it gives this script a lot of flexibility in what it can do. Now we should be able to run this. We first need to grab up all of the Azure AD users that we want to add to there. And let's make sure there's some actually in there. Yep, all right, they're all in there. Run the script and let's see what happens. Notice now, nothing is interactive. It's all being done one at a time, and it's showing you the verbose output because I used the verbose parameter. So it's creating the group, adding the users to the AD group, creating the team, adding the team option, allow custom memes, because you can see I did choose to set that specific team option. Then this is from the module itself, this created group with group ID, successfully create a team, adding user, adding channel. So it goes through and automates all of that stuff. This script, and it was successful. So this script is a really good framework, a really good foundation for you to build upon your own, make it your own. If you have a standard set of ways that you create a new team, or maybe some specific standardized way that you create teams for a department or Azure AD groups, by all means, edit this and make it your own. If you made it this far, I hope your brain's not fried. We covered a lot of code. Now, I know that there was no way you could have truly digested everything that script covered. To download a copy for yourself and begin playing with it, feel free to go to varonis.com/adamscripts. There you will find all the code covered in this tutorial. Thanks for sticking around, and now, get automating with PowerShell. Hello, and welcome to this Varonis tutorial entitled How to Automate Expiring Sessions for a Compromised Office 365 User Account, which is a little bit long after just reading that, I have noticed. Anyway, employees come and go all the time. When you're using Office 365 in your environment, an employee may have access to many different kinds of resources. And when that employee is terminated, you need to ensure all of that access is removed. How do you know you've cut off access to all of them? It's really harder than you think, considering all the different services that are out there these days. In this tutorial, you're going to learn how to automate immediately disabling an Office 365 user account to save time and limit chances of a rogue former employee accessing company resources. In this tutorial, you're going to learn how to build a PowerShell script. This PowerShell script is going to save you a ton of time by automating all the various little pieces that you have to do to make sure that employee is truly cut off from access from Office 365 services. We'll set up a test AD user to play with and then really get down to it. You'll learn how to revoke tokens from a user, refresh tokens to make the change as immediate as possible. We'll also cover some code to create conditional access policy to immediately reject access. When we're done, we'll have a PowerShell script you can use and work from to modify and make your own. So here I am in Visual Studio Code. I'm going to be using Visual Studio Code as my editor for this tutorial, but you're free to use any other kind of editor that you want. I'm also going to be using the PowerShell extension, so if you want to follow along exactly how I am and have it look exactly like I do, make sure you have Visual Studio Code installed and the PowerShell extension. And one other thing I wanted to point out early on was that I'm going to be using Windows PowerShell 5.1. So here in Visual Studio Code, you see the drop down here, we have PowerShell and the integrated console. PowerShell number 1 here is the Windows PowerShell 5.1. I'm going to be using that because unfortunately the Azure AD module has a few issues with authentication. So I've just chosen to take the path of least resistance and just use Windows PowerShell for the demonstration. So with that out of the way, let's get started. First up is the prerequisites. Now, if you want to follow along exactly how I am and run the script that I will be providing for you later, you need to first have your Azure AD tenant. So we're going to be revoking rights in Azure AD, and in particular in Office 365. Now, to do that, you need to have a user with global administrator or SharePoint online administrator credentials. There's a few different things and steps in here that we're going to be doing. And one thing that I did want to point out that I originally had a step regarding conditional access policies to reject immediately access to all the Office 365 services, but unfortunately I discovered that you do have to have an Azure AD Premium P1 license for that, and I don't have that in my demo environment unfortunately, but I did still leave the code for you, and we'll go over that in a minute. So you do need that Premium P1 license if you intend to use the conditional access policy code that I will be providing. So to really get started, let's first make sure we have some modules. So in this script, like a lot of different other Azure AD and Office 365 scripts, you need to have a couple modules. Number one, you need to have the Azure AD module. This module contains lots and lots and lots of Azure AD commandlets to do just about anything you want to do. And you also need the SharePoint module as well, because we will be needing to run some SharePoint commandlets to revoke an access token. So I already have these installed, but I will go ahead and try to run these again, and it should just go through real quick. Yep, all right, and it works. Next up, we need to import them. Now, I'd like to do this explicitly sometimes just to make sure that they import correctly. PowerShell has an auto import feature, which will do that for you whenever we run the commands that need them, but I like to do it ahead of time to make sure everything is working okay. So do that. It looks like it works, and it looks like, Microsoft Online SharePoint PowerShell module that whoever the authors didn't write some good commandlets there with some unapproved verbs, but oh well, we'll forgive them for that one. All right, continuing on, once we have those modules, next we need to do some authentication. To make sure we're going to hit all of the bases of revoking all of the access that we could possibly can, we're going to need to hit two services, Azure AD and SharePoint Online. So first up, we need to run connect Azure AD to authenticate to our Azure Active Directory environment. So when I run this, I can come over here and sign into my account. And my Azure AD tenant is Adam the Automator. Yours is probably different, so make sure that you sign in with an account with global administrator permissions. I did assign that output to a variable because I will need some of those IDs later on in the script. So now I do need a SharePoint connection. You see here in some of the comments that I write that is necessary for the revoke SPO user session commandlet. And the documentation for this process is a little bit unclear, let's just say. But just to be safe, I did include this in here to make sure that we did revoke all the access like we needed to. All right, so next up, we need to run connect SPO service and provide the URL of your SharePoint site, your SharePoint Online site. So I will go ahead and do this, and it should prompt me exactly the same, and then I will log in with my same credentials. And voila, no error is good. Now, we are authenticated and logged in, and we should be able to be good to go. We're going to create a test user. If you're running this code in a production environment, you're most likely always going to have user. In this scenario, we're pretending like there's an employee that was terminated and you need to terminate access immediately. However, since I don't really have a good test user at this time, I'm going to go ahead and create one. And creating one is just a simple matter of getting the right password and the right object that the new Azure AD user commandlet needs, and then creating a new Azure AD user. There's nothing special about this code. Just remember that our user account name is going to be test user 4. That is the rogue employee, let's say, that needs to immediately have his access removed. So we're going to run this, and now we assign that Azure AD user to AZ AD user, and let's see what that looks like. Yep, we have the object ID, display name, test user 4. Yep, all right. So we now have the Azure AD user called test user 4. That's going to be our rogue employee. Next, I included this spot in here because it is very useful, especially if you want to see not only just immediately revoke access, but see what kind of activity that's been going on for the account. But unfortunately, you'll find that the Azure AD and the Azure AD preview module, they aren't quite baked yet, especially from PowerShell core, but they are working on it. I did do some research and they are working on it, but they do have in the Azure AD preview module, they do have this handy command called get Azure AD audit sign-in logs. And I provided the code here. I'll give you the link whenever we're done with the tutorial, but to get the code. But this commandlet allows you to immediately see all of the different activity for a particular client. You see, we have the date, time, the app that they use, the client app, conditional access data, token issuer type, lots of different information about that. So I did include this line in here. I'm not going to go over it because unfortunately it's not going to work that great for me, especially because I do not have the Azure AD Premium license. That is one thing I should mention, that to run this command, you do have to have the Azure AD Premium license. I unfortunately do not have that in my demo environment, but this code is there nonetheless in case you do. Line 90, you see at this point, let's just say that the employee has been terminated. So we have our test user 4 account created. So you can see I am logging in as my rogue employee. I have signed in and I can just click around here, do whatever I want in OneDrive and SharePoint, whatever I want to do in here. So I'm logged in. So now I am the rogue user and I have access to company resources. At this point, we would reset the password. So let's say this is password new. So let's reset it. Then we'll come back over here and notice that we can still access resources. Everything still works exactly the same, even though the passwords have been reset. So it hasn't revoked our access. we need to do a few other things to revoke that as soon as possible. So first up, we can reset the SharePoint Online password. Now, when we run this revoke SPO user session commandlet, it's going to sign us out of all connected devices to SharePoint. The revoke SPO user session just requires simply one parameter, the user principal name. And I'm getting that from the user principal name property on the Azure AD user we just created. So I run this. It says we successfully signed out from all devices. So here I am signed in as the user account, and I can still get around. Notice it's not immediate. I can still get around to SharePoint. I can still open up things. However, this is what happens here. It didn't immediately sign us out, but it does prompts us for the password. Now, since we revoked the session, that just means it signed us out. Now, if the employee knew the password, they would just simply put in the password again and refresh. However, since we had reset the password, they should be out by now. But there are times when this doesn't work completely. So, for example, this is in SharePoint. There are sometimes in OneDrive that doesn't allow you, there's certain situations that it doesn't immediately revoke things. So you see here, there's a lot of different connections that you can make to Office 365. In this example, this remote, the Powershell sessions, there's the refresh the browser, open another Office 365. There's lots of different Office 365 services out there, and you need to make sure to run revoke Azure AD user all refresh token. When we run that goes out and just blasts all of the Office 365 services that you can. This does say that it takes 1 hour for this effect to work. So unfortunately, there's no real good way to immediately do it. We did immediately kick out this one, but there are some situations and some services that will not be kicked out for an hour. However, we have done everything we possibly can automated-wise to kick this user out. But unfortunately, that's not always the case. They may be able to get back in certain situations. However, there is a way around that. Unfortunately, it's not easy. But unfortunately for you, I did provide a piece of code to create a conditional access policy. So this piece of code that I've created here, which you will be given access to at the end of the tutorial, since we can't immediately reject all access to all Office 365 services, you can actually create a conditional access policy. But unfortunately, it does require an Azure AD Premium P1 license, and I don't have that in my demo environment. So I can't actually demonstrate it for you, but I did have someone else demonstrate this code. I did build all the code for you to allow you to do this. So just real quick, go down through this in case you can create this conditional access policy. This conditional access policy uses a service principal. So we first create an app registration. I have automated this. Then we perm IDs, permission IDs. I'm not going to go through this code one by one, but essentially, overall, what this is doing is creating an app registration, assigning all the appropriate permissions to it. Application.readAll, policy read all, policy read conditional access, and policy read write conditional access. And then once that's all done, then it commits all those permissions to the app registration with the set Azure AD application command. There's one manual part in here. You'll see Azure Portal, go to Azure Active Directory, app registrations, this API, the name of the API permission. All this information is in here. I don't expect you to memorize this or note this, document this, but just know that this will be included in the code whenever you get access to this. And then finally, create the client secret for that app registration. We first need the app registration for the conditional access policy. Next, you have the code to create the conditional access policy. Now, I've created some comments in here for you to look at if you would like to, but essentially, this uses the Graph API. There's no built-in commandlet to do this, so we have to go directly to the Graph API. I provided you all the code that you need to do that for this to work. So essentially, you first grab a Graph API token. I provided this. We use invoke REST method to do that. Now, the majority of this conditional access code here is in JSON. So we have the policy. The policy is the name, the display name, the state. We're obviously going to enable it because we want to enable it immediately. And then here we have the conditions. So we have client app types. There's lots of different app types. Since we want to reject everything for this particular user, we specify all. And especially include applications as well, all app types and all applications. And then for the include users section, Then we specify the object ID of the user. Now, there is one instance where we were doing some testing, and you may have to make sure you have this in here, because if you don't have this in here, it's going to include everybody in your tenant and bad things will happen. Let's just say don't do that, but make sure that you have the object ID in there. And then we're blocking all built-in controls. So everything is in JSON. So notice that here we define this in an ordered hash table. And then on line 239, that's when we're converting it to JSON. And then once we have that whole policy defined in JSON, then we can set the policy by creating a params block. And we're using splatting to pass all that to invoke REST method. This creates a single conditional policy that immediately rejects all of it. It doesn't care about the refresh token. This is just simply a matter of immediacy and making sure with 100% certainty that they cannot access any services. And then here, if you need to remove this, I added the removal code in here for you, because if you are creating this conditional access policy just for the sole purpose of excluding access for this one user, because the minimum amount of time you can revoke all access is an hour before that token expires, you can remove this conditional access policy after the hour. And then at that point, it's really not needed anymore. We are just creating the access policy just for immediacy. That is all of the code that we need to revoke all access. However, I have created a sample script for you to take away, because right now all we're seeing is just all this interactive code. I just showed you this interact. You can't actually take this and run with it in your environment. This is just demonstration code. I've created a script that you will be given a link at the end of the tutorial called revoke user access. And this does all of the stuff that we had just went over, all wrapped up in a single script with a single parameter called username. All you have to do is run revoke user access, provide the username of whatever the user account name is. And since we were using test user 4 up here, that will immediately revoke everything in there. So let me quickly go over what that script is. So I have it open over here, and you can see this is a real official PowerShell script. It's not a demonstration one like we have over here. Going from top to bottom, we need the require statement, because we need to build this script as self-sufficient as possible. We don't need all that install module, connect stuff. We're going to assume all that's already been done. So we need to make sure that it's running Windows PowerShell. That's the PS Edition desktop, because unfortunately the Azure AD module is a little flaky in PowerShell core. And then because we will be running commandlets inside of the Azure AD module and the Microsoft Online SharePoint PowerShell module, we do need those. So we put that data validation up front to make sure that the script can't even run if those requirements are not met. Then for the parameter, we just have one, username. Notice there on 17, we have a string and then the brackets. That's allowing multiple strings. So if we need to revoke multiple user accounts, we would simply run the script. Like right here we only have one. Let's say we have another one, foo, separated with the bar, whatever you want. You can revoke access to as many as you can if we have the square brackets in there. And then going down through here, I made it a little fancier this time. It's much simpler than the script, than the demonstration script. Notice this one was 200 and something lines. This script is only 47 lines. It does generally the same thing. What this script is doing, it's for each username that is provided starting on 26, is going to create a loop. It's going to first look for that Azure AD user in Azure AD. If it's not found, it's just going to send us a warning saying could not find the Azure AD user for a username. So there's some data validation in there. Next, if it does find it, it's going to kick off all those steps. There's 3 primary steps that we use to immediately revoke access. We first reset the password. Now notice here on 32, I'm getting a little bit fancier, I guess, with the using the generate password method on the system web security membership .NET type. We do that because it's just a random password. We don't even know what it is whenever it sets it. So that's a good way to set a random password. At this point, we just want to just lock out the user completely so they don't know the password. We don't even care if we know the password. So that's doing that with set Azure AD user password. Then next, we are running that revoke SPO user session, just like we did before. And then finally, revoke Azure AD user all refresh token. Exactly the same process like we were before. except it's all in one nice package that you can run with logging. All right, so now let's run this real quick and see what it looks like. So if we go, let's add verbose so we can get some logging information. And I hope this script is still on my desktop. All right, good, no errors. Now, notice that we got some output looking for the Azure AD user, so we don't have to worry about that get Azure AD user account. Found it. Resetting the user password successfully, revoked the online token, success, and revoked the Azure AD refresh token. It did all the little things that we had up here, all in quick succession. Now, since we didn't cover the conditional access policy, that is only if you have the Azure AD Premium. You could easily add that in there as well. Since you will get complete access to it, you feel free to use the script however you need to be. You can also add this in here and create these policies by incorporating these, adding all of this code that I provided in here. Just add it in here as another step. So that's a really great script to do everything you possibly can to revoke all access for Azure AD and all Office 365 services. If you made it this far, I hope your brain's not fried. We covered a lot of code. I know there's no way you truly digested everything that was covered in that script. To download a copy for yourself and begin playing with it, feel free to go to varonis.com/adamscripts. There you will find all of the code covered in this tutorial. Thanks for sticking around. And now, get to automating with PowerShell. Hello and welcome to this Varonis tutorial entitled How to Build an Automated User Provisioning Script. If you're a sysadmin, chances are you probably have a process to provision new AD and Office 365 accounts. If you're still clicking around, even spending more than just maybe a few minutes doing that, you're in for a treat in this tutorial. Let's get going and see how much time we can save by automating this with PowerShell. Before I get too far, you might be asking yourself, why are we doing this anyway? There are so many ways to get this done with the typical point-and-click GUI. We do it ourselves to provision these user accounts. Why would you want to automate this process? Well, the answer is the same for all automation projects: standardization and reduced errors. When you automate a repeatable, predictable process like provisioning Office 365 mailboxes, Teams channels, Azure AD groups, or lots of other things you'll see in this tutorial, you ensure the process is done the same every single time. You also remove all those pesky, error-prone humans from the mix. The result is a cleaner and much, much quicker approach. Have I convinced you yet? If not, stick around. I'll try to get you convinced by the end of this tutorial. You'll be happy to know this tutorial only has 3 slides. This is the last one, I promise. In this tutorial, you're going to build a PowerShell script. This script is going to save you a ton of time, I promise. In this tutorial, you're going to learn how to create a script that does a lot of stuff, as you can see here. But more importantly, it will give you a foundation for you to build upon once I share the link at the end of the tutorial. I'll show you how to automate lots of things around Azure AD and Office 365 in this tutorial. But really, the most important takeaway is all the code you'll get to play around with at the end. For this demo, we're going to go over a scenario. So just think about this in your head. Think about, you're doing the same task every day, maybe for every Azure AD user you set up. You're creating a user account, creating a mailbox, signing into a team, signing in a license, adding to specific groups, just a lot of different stuff. You need to figure out a way to save time. So let's automate that. That's what this demo is going to be about. All right, just like I usually always do for the prerequisites, I always have some kind of prerequisite section. Fortunately for you, really, we're only going to be using PowerShell 5.1, which is Windows PowerShell. Unfortunately, we cannot use PowerShell Core at this time because there is some compatibility issues with the Azure AD modules and the Microsoft Teams module that we'll be using. So we will be using Windows PowerShell 5.1, and I'll assume that you are on Windows 10 as you're going through this. All right, next up, we need to prepare. So we need to do a one-time demonstration, a one-time setup of everything we need to have this happen on a daily basis. So you would do this preparation phase once. So let's just briefly go through the preparation phase. So this tutorial, we're going to need 2 modules, Azure AD and Microsoft Teams. To get those installed, we simply run install module. I will run that. And that should be really quick because I already have it installed, and we need the Microsoft Teams module. That should be quick as well. Yep. So those are installed. Next, we can import them. I like to import these right away to make sure there's no errors or anything in the import, because PowerShell will try to auto import them if you allow it to, but I always like to import them ahead of time to make sure that they import okay. Yep, and those did import. Once we have them imported, then we need to authenticate to both. And to authenticate, you typically see a connect dash whatever service it is. In this case, we need to authenticate to Azure AD to manage the Azure AD users and groups and those sort of things. And we need to authenticate to Teams because we will be adding the user to a team. Running these is very simple. You simply just run it and provide your username and password for your tenant. I've already done that, so I'll go ahead and just skip this step. Next, we want to retrieve the license. So whenever we create the Azure AD user, we need to assign a license to these. There's all kinds of different options and different ways you can do, and this will depend on whatever is currently available in your tenant. So to find all of the available licenses, you can run get Azure AD subscribe SKU. And when I just run this, you'll see that I have two, Enterprise Pack and Flow Free. I'm going to assign all of the users I create with the Enterprise Pack SKU. Next up, I need to define my role GUIDs. Now, whenever the CSV that I'm going to be showing you in a minute, one of the steps is we're going to add the users. We are going to add the users to a particular role. So we're going to assign them a particular role. And those roles are going to be either Help Desk Administrator, Application Administrator, or Billing Administrator. And because there's some lookup in here, we need to find the object ID of each of these. And just as a way to quickly have a way to look up the object ID and map that to a particular role name, I'm just creating a hash table here in line 53 to be able to look that up. So we need to have this to look up the IDs of a few of those role templates. All right, continuing on. Next up, I've already done this, but I did conclude this in the script. You will have this script available to you whenever I'm done. I'll give the link to it. But essentially, this creates the two Azure AD groups and the Microsoft team that we need. You will need to have these ahead of time because as of now, the script does not auto-create the groups. I'm assuming that you already have the Contoso team group and the finance users group and the finance department and Microsoft Teams team available already. So the code is in here if you need to do that. All right. Before we get down to really doing a bunch of them at once, we need to learn how to do one of them. Make sure we have all the code available to us and it's working. So this is what I always do. I always build the code to do a single one. Once we have that code to do a single one, it's really easy to expand that and scale that. So first off, we need to create the Azure AD user. I'm assuming this is going to be a brand new AD user for an employee perhaps. All right, first off, we need to create the password profile. We need to create the password profile because this is the type of object that the new Azure AD user commandlet needs to pass the password to the commandlet. And then you can see there in the parameters, I'm using some splatting, so defining all the parameters ahead of time, then passing them to new Azure AD user. Display name, password profile, which is the password we just went over. User principal name, this will be different depending on your tenant. I have one test user at Adam the Automator. Adam the Automator is my Azure AD tenant. I am enabling it and just setting the mail nickname to one test user. This could be just about anything. But for now, we just want to make sure that we don't get any kind of syntax errors. So let me go ahead and run this, and I will assign the output to the user variable. And let's see what's in there. And yep, no errors, and we did have some output. So that's good. I needed the user variable here because I will be using this later on in this script, so I don't have to keep calling that commandlet over and over and over again. All right, next up, to create a mailbox, we don't have to run this new mailbox. We can actually do a few things. We can set the usage location. You have to have the usage location set before you can set a license. The license actually creates the mailbox. So let me first set the usage location. That's set Azure AD user. Set Azure AD user is a very handy commandlet that you use constantly if you need to modify existing users. Next up, here's where we create the license. The license can be just about anything, like I was saying, so we don't have to keep defining that license over and over again. There on line 87, that's where I'm getting the SKU ID of the SKU that we had pulled earlier. Now you can see I have an object ID here. When I use .SKU ID, that just references that property. So I will go ahead and assign all these this license information that we need. Next up, 93, that's where we set Azure AD user license. We are assigning that license to the user using the user's object ID that we returned by new Azure AD user, and then the assigned licenses, which we just created above. When we run this, that should work. Yep, no errors. Continuing on, next is where we add this user account to a few roles. I just picked a few roles at random, maybe help desk administrator or application administrator. Now, in this step, in this part of the step, we are looping through each of those roles. On line 97, you see a for each loop, looping through each of those role names. On 98, we're then checking for that role because we need to run get Azure AD directory role to find the ID of that role to make sure it exists. And there on line 99 through 102, I have that step in there because sometimes you'll find that you'll have the role, but it might be disabled. This is a conditional check to make sure that the role is enabled before we try to assign a user to it. So there on line 99, there's a role disabled property you can check. And if it exists, then it's just going to go ahead and run enable Azure AD directory role and get that role enabled for you. And then finally on 105, we run add Azure AD directory role member, which actually assigns that user to that particular role. So let's go ahead and run this piece. And looks like it, no errors. No errors is always good. Oh, one other thing I want to say, you notice how we're kind of going through these one at a time. They really have no dependency on each other. This is very common when you're building one of these automation scripts. You're able to simply just plug in or remove certain pieces. Because each of these aren't dependent on each other, we just simply can just add another piece in here and make this script as really as large and as complex as you would like. All right, anyway, so next up we are adding that user to a group called finance users. I'm assuming you already have the Azure AD group called finance users set up. I'm just looping through that, grabbing the ID just like I would, and then running add Azure AD group member. And then we have a spot so we can add the user to a Microsoft team. Here, same general thing, getting the team, getting that ID on 116, and then running add teams user to add that user account to that particular team. And we are good to go. So now, what I will do is I'll show you the user in the portal here. All right, so here I am in the Microsoft 365 Admin Center, and let's check on that one test user. One test user. And now we can see that the roles, help desk admin, application admin, the groups are created. So everything has been created. It even has the Office 365 E3 license all set up. So now that we have done that, let's go ahead and clean up that user account so we can do it one more time. This time, Automagical. So I'm not going to go over all that code again. We're going to run that code over and over and over again. It's just going to be really quick this time via a CSV file. So another popular way to import lots of information at once is to use a CSV file. So I'm going to import a CSV file, doing nothing fancy at all here, running the import CSV to get that in memory, and then I'll show you what the user's variable is. See, we have two users in here, test user 4 and test user 5. So two users in a CSV file. Once we have those users in a CSV file, we can then just quickly loop through all that stuff. Here's why I have this code. And I'm not going to go over this code again. It's nearly exactly the same as what it did with a single user, although there's a few differences because we are running in a loop. But for the most part, it's exactly the same. You'll have all this code available to you if you like to look at it. This is the big point. Our users variable for each object. For every one of those rows in that CSV, it's going to run. So I will run all of this, and we should not receive an error. At least I hope not. And you could improve this. You see that I have some kind of error handling here. I have write error. You could put some write host information here to say recording lists or adding this. It's completely up to you. Like I said, you'll have this code for you. All right, so now that just kind of shows you the general workflow that you can do to build something like this. Now I'm going to go ahead and remove all of these users that I just created, and I will show you a much quicker way to do all this. So previously you saw that we had used, up to 248 lines here, and it was all kind of hit and miss. There wasn't a lot of things. There was just like one task, another task, another task. It's pretty complicated seeing all this code. We can do the exact same thing if we compartmentalize all that and put it into a single script. So to show you what that script does, I have a little script demo here. And I have a script called new Acme user. You call it new, whatever your company name is, user.ps1. And to do all that stuff that we did up here on line 245, we simply need to run import CSV, pass all those rows in that CSV file to the script called new Acme user.ps1, and then it's done. It's really that all it is. So I'm taking all that code that I created in here, compartmentalize it into a single tool. And this is what I would call a reusable tool that you can use over and over again. All the code that it's doing is generally exactly the same. It's doing the same functionality. It's just wrapped in a nice package to where you can easily reuse it. I've added some comment-based help here. You can add whatever you need there. Here I have some parameters. This is where it has all of the parameters to create a particular user, all the information that we need. Now, one thing you see that I did add that's optional was all those values from pipeline by property name parameter attributes. Those are there because I would like to use the pipeline. So notice that I'm not actually using any named parameters explicitly. I'm just passing all the information that came from import CSV over to new Acme user. So that's what allows that to bind all of these. So you can see that these parameters are exactly the same as the CSV columns here. So the CSV columns are username, display name, password, create mailbox, roles. You see that these are exactly the same. Now, everything else is exactly the same for the most part. Like I was saying, I'm not going to go down through this code line by line, but essentially it's wrapping up all of these. Here's something else. This is just random things that I created that I thought may be useful. This is the great thing about PowerShell. For example, previously we were statically defining a password. In PowerShell, you can define a random password. So I just threw in a function called new random password, and that's ran whenever the user account is created. It just creates a random password for you. Once you kind of have this framework built out, you can easily add and remove all of these different components. So essentially, this is exactly the same. I prettied it up a little bit by changing the error validation a little bit more, added some verbose, some write warnings and things in here. But for the most part, all the code is exactly the same, and you will have all of this code available to you whenever you need it. All right, so let's see if this runs. All right, you can see now that everything did work. I put some verbose information in there so you can see what was going on. But essentially, all that new Acme user script did was compartmentalize all that stuff into a reusable tool. Now with that new Acme user script, we can simply pass entire CSV files to it, and it will do everything that we need to do all in one single line. So that's the beauty of writing PowerShell scripts or PowerShell tools. They allow you to save so much time by compartmentalizing all that information. So I highly encourage you to download this code, see what you can do with it, make it your own. I know there's going to be lots of different things that you need to do to it to maybe tweak it or add some different functionality to it. So download it, tweak it, make it your own, and save a lot of time. If you made it this far, I hope your brain's not fried. We covered a lot of code. I know there's no way you truly digested everything that was covered in that script. To download a copy for yourself and begin playing with it, feel free to go to varonis.com/adamscripts. There you will find all of the code covered in this tutorial. Thanks for sticking around. And now, get to automating with PowerShell. Hello and welcome to this Varonis tutorial entitled How to Find Suspicious Activity in Office 365 User Logs. Do you know what's going on in your Office 365 environment right now? You might have an idea, but there's really no way to truly stay on top of everything. There's just so much data to comb through. With the help of this tutorial, you'll learn how to write a PowerShell script to help you sift through Office 365 logs and potentially uncover nefarious activity. Before I get too far, you might be asking yourself, why are we doing this anyway? Why use PowerShell in particular to perform monitoring and reporting of Office 365? Well, I think there's three main reasons. One, automation. When you create a PowerShell script, that code is not only valuable for this current situation, but if built right, you can use it in larger automation frameworks too. PowerShell scripts can be building blocks, allowing you to plug in code and build a much more sophisticated automation framework if warranted. Second, ease of use. Unlike other programming languages, PowerShell is known for its easy to understand syntax. You don't have to be a software developer to write PowerShell. Then finally, you can do nearly anything you need to with Office 365 and PowerShell. As expected, Microsoft has favored its own language to support its own services. You can find a PowerShell module to perform just about any task you need to in Office 365, especially searching through logs. Have I convinced you yet? If not, stick around. I'll convince you by the time this tutorial is over. You'll be happy to know this tutorial only has a few slides. This is the last one, I promise. In this tutorial, you're going to build a PowerShell script that will help you track down Office 365 activity. You're going to set up a testing scenario if you'd rather not test in production. You don't test in production, right? Okay, I'll assume you don't. Anyway, the main point is to build a script that helps you report on a few example activities. We'll search a couple of different places in Office 365 that expose activity of your users. When done, you'll come away with a script allowing you to quickly and easily find various instances of certain activities. So let's see what we can do with tracking down some of that suspicious activity in Office 365. So to start off this demo, first let's think of a scenario that you may be in. So you may be thinking like, well, I don't know what's going on in my environment. Let's say that there is activity happening in Azure AD and specifically Office 365, and you need to get some insight in what's happening there. Maybe it's SharePoint, OneDrive, whatever. We need to figure out what's going on there in just a really quick snapshot way we can do that. So that's what we're going to do in this demo. Next, if you want to follow along exactly how I am, you will need a few prereqs, obviously Azure AD, Office 365, and I'm going to assume that you're authenticating as a global administrator account because I will be using a global administrator account. I don't know the security ramifications if you're using something else, it may be limited, but you will need that if you want to follow along exactly. And finally, unfortunately, we have to use Windows PowerShell here. We can't use the latest and greatest PowerShell core. There is a few workarounds that you'll see, but just because of some of the limitations with the Azure AD module, we will be using Windows PowerShell to do everything in here. First up, we need to do some preparation. So when I say preparation, this is creating a demo environment. This demo will be starting from scratch. You don't have to do anything. You don't have to have anything in your environment. I'm going to be recreating the test users and everything like that to begin with. So you can just immediately get started whenever you need to. All right, first up, we need to connect to Azure AD. And you'll get access to all of this code that I provided in here, but I've provided lots of different comments and things that you may need to be aware of. So for example, here's this issue that I came up with Azure AD and using PowerShell 7. So if you would like to try out PowerShell 7, any kind of version with PowerShell core, feel free to do so, but unfortunately, it's not quite as easy as using Windows PowerShell, but I have all these notes in here for you. So I've already done these, but I'm not going to go through these, but you will have the code to run through on your own. So I always like to import the modules ahead of time because sometimes you'll find is, especially with Azure AD, if you would just install it, it would install fine with PowerShell core, but unfortunately, whenever you get down to it actually using the commandlets, then you'll find out that an error happens. I usually like to import the modules right after I install them, so you can install the Azure AD. And one thing that I didn't include in here was the actual syntax to add Azure AD. So you can just run install module Azure AD, and that will get that installed. And then once you have it installed and imported, then you need to authenticate. You use Connect Azure AD to do that. It's just very simple. You log in with your username and password. In this case, I am the global administrator, and then you authenticate, and you're all authenticated to Azure AD. Since we are going to be working some with Exchange Online, you will need to log into Exchange Online. Now, Exchange Online is a little bit different. It doesn't have a specific PowerShell module per se, but it uses a feature called PowerShell's implicit remoting. So with Exchange Online, you actually go out to an internet endpoint, in this case, outlook.office365.com, provide your tenant username and password, and then it will establish a PowerShell remoting session to that endpoint. And then using import PS session, it will import all of the various commandlets that are available. So this feature is called PowerShell's implicit remoting feature. It's a very handy feature if you don't have a module locally installed. That way you can remotely use commandlets from a machine that has a remote module installed. So very simple again. You could just simply provide your credentials with get credential and then run import PS session, and it will typically just work just fine. So not much to do about that one. All right, so next up, The demo users, I've already created demo users, but I do want to show you the code to do this in case you want to do this exactly on your own. I want to create some common account criteria. So I'm doing this because I'm going to be creating two accounts. I'm going to be creating one account from an executive, some kind of high privileged account, and I'm going to be creating an account for a potentially nefarious user, maybe some kind of suspicious hacker, or even just somebody that you would like to spy on if you want. But anyway, for this first part here, I want to define some specific criteria for that have both in common. So for example, I'm going to create the same password for both of them. I'm going to make sure they're both enabled. It's going to be the same tenant name, and then I'm going to assign the same license pack. So right in this area here, it's just simply defining some common code criteria that I have that's going to be creating both of these. I'm going to create a high privileged account. So this can be any account you want. This is just going to represent some kind of executive account, some kind of account that maybe somebody would want to get access to. And here's the code to do that. Essentially, creating an Azure AD account, I'm going to be calling it CEO, and then I'm going to assign a license to it. Now you see that for Online 88, I'm using license SKU.SKUID. You will need to change that up here. Online 73, right now I'm using my Enterprise Pack license. That is the license that I have. You may want to change that if you have something different. If you have something different you want to check, you can run get Azure AD subscribe SKU on its own. When you run that, you'll see all the different licenses that you have available that you can apply to that. All right, so once you have that high privileged account, then you can create a quote-unquote nefarious user. Now, there's going to be three different user accounts in this mix. There's going to be one, the CEO, which is the high privileged account. There's going to be my personal account, my Adam@adamtheautomator.com, the one that I have authenticated to, the one that I'm making these changes to. And then we're going to have this nefarious user I'm calling Mr. Suspicious. This is the one that maybe some kind of other suspicious user wants to forward email to. We need some place to send other information to. So this is like a second account for that nefarious user. And here doing exact same thing, creating a new Azure AD user. Nothing fancy here. Assigning a mailbox, nothing fancy whatsoever here. Just creating some kind of endpoint that we can use for the demonstration. All right, next up, we need to create some suspicious activity. Here's where the rubber meets the road. If you're in a large environment, you probably don't even need to have to do this, but in a demo environment, this is really good to do just to generate some activity that we can then search for later on to give you a demonstration of what I'm talking about. So there are lots of different scenarios here. These are just a few of them that we're going to search. Essentially, I've narrowed this down to some Azure AD activity and a lot of Exchange Online activity. You can do lots of different things, but for now, we are just going to be demonstrating these just to show you kind of the gist and give you a framework of what you can do here. Well, so the first instance that I'm going to do is add a user to the company administrator role. If you're not already familiar, Azure AD has lots and lots and lots of Azure AD directory roles. If we run get Azure AD directory role, we have lots of here, application developer, directory readers. These are just a few of them that I have in my environment. There's lots of different roles. One of the most powerful roles is the company administrator role, and you want to make sure that you tightly know each user that has these company administrator roles. Whenever a maybe potentially nefarious user runs add Azure AD directory role member, they are giving them all the rights that the company administrator role has. And here on line 135, here is where I am assigning that suspicious user the company administrator role, giving them high privilege in this environment. So you want to make sure you know this. Next up, let's say that somebody created a new Azure AD app registration. I have some notes here. An Azure AD app can have access to lots of different other permissions and sets. So it could be, you can set a service principal to have access to lots of different things. This is something else that I just thought of that you may want to know about. Here I'm just creating an Azure AD app called New Graph API Access. So just another demonstration, just generating some activity of what we can do. Next, we go into Exchange Online. Now, Exchange Online, there's lots of different command lists that we pulled down from that implicit remoting section. Here I'm defining to add mailbox permission and add recipient permission. Now with this, I am assigning these permissions on that CEO user mailbox and assigning it to my suspicious user. So you can see here on line 154, I'm giving that suspicious user full rights to the CEO mailbox, and then also giving it rights to send email as that CEO. So you do need to know about what's going on here. And since we are running these PowerShell command, let's add mailbox permission and add recipient permission. I will show you later on when we go to see all this activity, we can easily pull out who ran what PowerShell commandlets. All right, continuing on, here's another one, setting mailbox forward. This is another one to where you can set a mailbox forward to from maybe the CEO to that nefarious user. In this case, we're doing just that. We're running set mailbox, another PowerShell command we can easily audit, and we're just setting the forwarded address to that suspicious user. Same general concept. That suspicious user wants to get access to that CEO or that high privileged mailbox, and they ran set mailbox to do that. Since they did run set mailbox to do that, we can easily audit that, which I will show you here in just a minute. Next up is another one. New inbox rule. This suspicious user is just setting up another way to see what's going into that CEO user's mailbox. So again, they ran a PowerShell commandlet. We can easily audit that. Now, since we have created the accounts, we have the users to test with, we've generated some activity, now we can get down to the good stuff where we can actually start searching a few logs. I have two different kinds of logs, the unified audit log on 181 and the admin audit log on 223. The unified audit log is a really handy audit log that gives you access to activity from SharePoint, Exchange, OneDrive, lots of different Office 365 activities in one single log. So in this instance, I'm just running search unified audit log, providing the start date and end date and the result size of 5,000. So it's essentially grabbing all of the activity that's happened between 9/7/2020 and 9/8/2020 and giving you all the information between across all of the Office 365 services. And for the result size, by default, it will only return 100 instances. If you know you have more than that, you can return 5,000. 5,000 is the maximum. So I've just chosen to choose 5,000, just to say, just give me all of them. So I will go ahead and run this. And then this will take just a second. Fortunately, it's very quick. I can't believe how quick it is just to go search through all of that different activity. Once it's assigned, here it's going to assign it to an audit variable. When I look at the audit variable, see there's a lot of stuff. It's just going to go flying down through here, and let's see how many audit events it has captured so far. So it's got 38 events captured between 9/7 and 9/8. So since this is the demo environment, there's not a whole lot of events, so you will probably have a lot more to deal with. So fortunately, I provided some code on 195 to 202 here that parses out that information. So we only want to see certain information. So on 197 and 198, you see that I only want to see the instances where somebody added an app registration or they added an Azure AD application and they assign some member to a role. So there I'm defining my audit events and I'm searching through those on line 201 where I'm saying only those audit events that contains that certain operation. So I'm parsing those out, filtering this as I need to. All right, once I have that, then you can look at your unified results. You see that's a lot cleaner. It's a much cleaner than what it was, but it's not perfect because we do not have like specific names. So you see lots of different IDs in here. And unfortunately, you look at an ID, like I have no idea what that ID is. I want a user name. I want some kind of name. We can take that a step further by parsing this out a little bit more and providing a custom output. So here I'm taking that raw data, and then 209 through 218, I'm creating a custom object. This is going to be the object that I'm outputting. So I'm going to be outputting creation time, operation, not only the object ID, but the name, not only the target object ID, but the target name type. So I'm essentially giving you some friendlier output than what you would normally get from the default output. So when I run this, I will loop through all of that data. And then now you can see, let me expand this up a little bit, some other information. We have the actor name now, the actor type, I am a user. So it says Adam Bertram, I added an application. Adam Bertram, I added added a member to a role. There's another instance where I added an application, another instance where I added another member to the role, and then here you can see that it recorded the Sophie Hatton. That's the username that I was playing with it for when I was creating this demo. So it recorded all of that information, and with this code, you can easily parse out that information and build a nice script from that. Finally, we have the search admin audit log. Now this is another handy log that shows you all of the different PowerShell commands that are run in Exchange Online. Now for this instance, I only want to know about 3 commands that were ran on Exchange Online. New inbox rule, set mailbox, and add mailbox permission. So this is going to search the admin audit log or the Exchange Online log for only these 3 command lists that have been run. You see in 235, the command to do that is called search admin audit log, providing the start date and end date, which is today, filtering out all of these stars. So you'll see in some instances in the audit log where they have stars, that means that it cannot identify the caller or the originator or the person that actually made the change. So that's really just irrelevant information, so I'm filtering that out. And then finally, I'm saying where mailbox events contains the commandlet name. That's just saying only give me the audit information that contains the commandlet names that I'm worried about. All right, so let's run this. And then we go admin results. And again, we have some good information, but it's not perfect. We want to spice this up with it. We don't care about the run space ID. We don't care about this modified properties. We don't care about lots of this other information. We can take that and parse that information out in a much better way and get some custom output. And to do that, on 237 here through 249, I'm parsing that out. I'm essentially using PowerShell to make this in a friendlier output. Now, this is just one example. You can make any example that you can parse this out and format this in any way you like with PowerShell, which is the beauty of PowerShell, which I love it so much. But here, essentially, I'm going to show you just one example of what I'm talking about here. So I created another admin results variable, and let's see what this looks like. So now you can see the time that it happened, the exact time that that commandlet was ran, the commandlet that was ran, the caller, which is the person that actually ran the command, what object was modified, and all the parameters that were applied to that. So it's a very handy PowerShell auditing capability that you can do in Exchange Online, especially when you're parsing this out and you're able to see this information much easier with, we did some formatting. So this is much easier to see. This is another really great feature of the Exchange Online auditing portion. Okay, so that is all of the code that I had generated to give you a takeaway, to give you something that you don't necessarily have to copy and paste all this and try to figure out all the logic and how this works. I've created a script for you. I've created a script called Invoke Suspicious Activity Report. Now this script brings together all the code that we just went over into a single PowerShell tool, and it's right here, which you will get access to after this demonstration is over with. And with this is a single PowerShell script that combines all of that stuff that we just did together. It's built with some best practices. So I will just quickly go over what this is. Not going to go over the code line by any means, because functionality-wise is exactly what we just went over, but I do want to show you maybe some PowerShell best practice on how to create a tool like this. So whenever you're creating a PowerShell script, you always need to validate all the information as soon as possible. So before you remember in the demo up here, I was saying the prerequisites. I was saying you needed to run Windows PowerShell. Here you can say requires PS Edition desktop. That is Windows PowerShell. This script will only run with Windows PowerShell. And again, over here I said we needed the Azure AD. We needed the Azure AD module. Here we say this script will only run if the Azure AD module exists. So this is something I always like to add. Comment-based help, I always add comment-based help as much as possible. That way that you know your future self or somebody else will know actually how to use this script. And here is where I define some parameters. These parameters are completely customizable for what you want. Here, I wanted to build a tool that encapsulated all the information everything that could potentially change. Let's say maybe that the start and end date, those are going to be always obvious. You're always going to need those. Those are mandatory. And then You also have Azure AD activity and mailbox PowerShell commands. So notice that I have a validate set in each of these. This is telling me that I can only use this parameter if it matches add application or add member to role. Now I added these in parameters here because they're undoubtedly going to be different Azure AD activity that you want to search for. You can simply add it here. So maybe if there's one called, I don't know, add service principal, or I don't know, something like that. You can add it here, and then you can easily pass that in as a parameter. Same thing with mailbox PowerShell command. You can simply add another mailbox PowerShell command that you want to search for, and then you can add it in here. And notice here on 27 and 31 where I define the types, you see string, open brace, close brace, and then another close brace. That's saying that you can provide not just one parameter value, you can provide lots of them. So I can do add application, add member to role, and then 2, 3, 4, however many I need. The same thing with mailbox PowerShell command. And then here where you get to the actual functional code, it's generally the exact same code. I just created some more comments to make it a little bit more readable, and some right verbose. So if I use the verbose, it will say searching the unified audit log, and then down here it's going to say searching the admin audit log. So you can add in different things, but for the most part, you can see that it's exactly the same kind of output. I just kind of spiffied up a little bit, encapsulated it all into a single script that you can run. All right, so to demonstrate that run, let me set the location of where that script is, and then we'll pass a few parameters to it. Now, in these parameters, start and end date, those are going to be mandatory. So I'm just saying here, I want to see all of the audit activity from both the admin audit log and the unified audit log from September 7th to September 8th. Defining the Azure AD activity, I want to see all of the instances where somebody added an application or added an app registration and added somebody to a role. And then for the mailbox PowerShell command, I'm saying I want to see who ran new mailbox rule, who ran new inbox rule, who ran set mailbox, and who ran add mailbox permission. And then for the verbose, that's an optional parameter. I'm just saying give me some verbose information that's going to show me what's going on. So we encapsulated all of that stuff that we just went over for in 254 lines or so into a single script. And when I run this, you can see that I just only have to run this once, and then it will say searching the unified audit log. It will automatically search all of that audit log, provide some output. Then it will search the admin audit log. Now, once you have this raw output like this in one script, you can easily pull this into an HTML report, pull it into a CSV file, Excel workbook, and then parse it out and read it however you like. If you don't get anything else out of this demo, download this code and just play with it and learn that you can create really fancy tools if you really want to. Take this script here, add it to you want, add some different parameters to it if you want, and really make it your own and be able to really dive down deep into what activity is going on in your environment. If you made it this far, I hope your brain's not fried. We covered a lot of code. I know there's no way you truly digested everything that was covered in that script. To download a copy for yourself and begin playing with it, feel free to go to varonis.com/adamscripts. There you will find all of the code covered in this tutorial. Thanks for sticking around, and now, get to automating with PowerShell.